Thank you so much, Kirsten. You heard the applause. That was really a keynote that spoke to me, to the audience, also emotionally, and you clearly formulated a role to the creative sectors, to the artistic sphere, which we're now gonna talk about it. Now the rest of the panel comes up the stage. Please give an applause to them while they're coming up. Thanks. Yeah, we might have to share one microphone. No? Everyone has? Ambra, Lars, get along. Okay, so now with us are, from left to right, Johanna Pichlbauer, speculative designer based in Vienna. She is the chairwoman of Designgesellschaft, the studio community and design collective. And next to her is Catherine Magnan, the head of the unit for cultural policy at DG-EAC at the European Commission. Lars Ebert, the Secretary General of Culture Action Europe, as you all know, the major network of cultural networks in Europe. And next to Lars is Ambra Trotto, the Design and Research Director at D-Center at RISE Sweden, and also the chair of the Strategic Topic Group Design for Societal Innovation at the new EIT Culture and Creativity. So the first EIT KIC, the Climate-KIC, founded in 2007, is that right?
No, 2000. We were formally 2010 we started.
2010, but the first?
Yep.
And the most recent one are sitting next to each other. And let's start with a question to Ambra. So we heard now about the mission of Climate-KIC and the role of the creative sector for making the Green Deal happen, basically, and achieving the Paris goals. And now this year in spring, EIT Culture and Creativity has been founded, and I know many people in the audience who contribute to it, who give their heart and soul as partners, as collaborators. So, speaking of this green transition, what's the EIT Culture and Creativity's take on it? What can we expect? Also not only the green transition, but also digital and societal transition, the whole mission of the new EIT KIC. What can we expect, Ambra?
Well, what I hope is that we have, and I think we have all the premises for that to happen, that we start bravely prototyping. I come from design and I believe in making. In order to change civilization, one starts from creating practices. I would like to build on the notion of hope. The sense of possibility was what Spinoza believed was the ethical good. Deleuze was talking about microfascism when the sense of hope is taken away from people. And in a way, the discipline where I come from in design is making possibility actionable. It's making people dream, making people hope, but doing it from an experiential, embodied perspective, close to the heart, close to what we are. And so what I do want to see the EIT Culture and Creativity working with is to prototyping at all different levels. We can't wait and get everybody on board around the table and decide how we're going to proceed. We have to start making things from calls, making like tangible, embodied things that are sensorially engaging people. This is what I would like to do. And there are, of course, actions to be working with. There are struggles that we will have to deal with. How do we actually bridge this messy gap? How do we get those decisions makers on board that are struggling to understand that we need a completely different way of looking at it? And if we do not embrace trust, and if we do not just believe that people that are driven, as most people in the culture and creative sector, by purpose, we don't need to measure so much. We just have to let them work and clean the way. So So this is what I hope the EIT Culture and Creativity will work with and for.
Thank you, thank you. Let's hand over to the European Commission, to Catherine. The two EITs are one example of European instruments for innovation, especially in these fields. What other initiatives do you support in which the sectors are empowered to face and also shape these societal transition processes?
Okay, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for this amazing event. Kirsten, you're an impressive speaker. It's very difficult to take the floor after you, but it was an absolutely amazing speech that I would love you to, make in the European Commission. We have to organize that at one point. And I'd like to pick up on, to answer your question, I'd like to pick up on some of the keywords and the structure that Kirsten used. So mindset in institutions, capabilities, narrative. Mindset and institutions, that's something very much on which we have been working and making progress at European level and at national level, and I will explain. At European level, working on mindset, this tremendously difficult change that has to be done. Kirsten mentioned it. I mean, we've launched the new European Bauhaus, which really is an attempt at giving a human face to the Green Deal, making it palatable for people, acceptable, trying to imagine cities, buildings that can be energy efficient, yet beautiful and socially affordable. So that was, that's what I can mention for the work on the mindset at European level. Then at national level, we are going to start next year an expert group. Okay, an expert group doesn't sound very sexy, but we're going to bring together people from ministries of culture and ministries of the environment from each EU member states. And they are going to sit around the table and speak together. And at European level, but also at the national level, those are ministries that do not speak that often together. And they are going to speak together. We're going to support that process and reflect on how to support the cultural and creative sectors better in order to contribute to changing mindsets, but also to green themselves. And I think that process in itself really will be helpful. And that's thanks to the fact that the EU Work Plan for Culture, so the menu on which the member states of the EU and the Commission have agreed to work together for the years to come, the 4 years to come, on culture at European level does include a priority on greening the sector and enabling it to play its role for changing mindsets. And I will just then now, and to support this process, we've also enabled the sector, the cultural and creative sectors. We've heard them through this Voices of Culture process. We've organized this meeting. Kirsten was coordinating it and steering it recently with the help of Elsa and the Goethe-Institut, and that was very important to hear what the sector had to say, and they will present now to the member states and to this expert group that I mentioned. So, that they are full contributors to the change processes that they have to make for themselves, but also that they have to lead. And finally, capabilities. We've been producing a number of tools recently. We've looked at ourselves. So there is a study on how to green Creative Europe, and that's just the beginning. We will continue on that path. On Creatives Unite, we've put together this online repository of good practices. We are funding several projects, calculators of emissions, particularly for the audiovisual. So that will continue, equipping the sectors and actors with tools and supporting them to put them together.
Great, thank you. Yesterday I read the Voices of Culture report and I found it really helpful, this roles that also Kirsten was explaining of the cultural sector, giving narratives, also working on itself, like the festival, but also reaching beyond to other sectors. And Lars, maybe coming to you, you represent a lot more than 100 cultural organizations in Europe, or even more?
220.
220. What do you think when you hear that, especially this role, kind of that culture is the last hope to, turn around the wheel or break before we hit the wall? It's a huge responsibility, but also, of course, and we talked about it today, the sector is not the most resilient, the strongest, the most financially equipped. We have precarious working conditions, we have the post-pandemic situation. Are we expecting too much from the sector, and what does the sector need to live up to that role?
Thank you. Of course, we are not expecting too much from the sector. This is exactly what we feel we can do, but there's this mantra where we say, listen, we've got a problem, we need support, and at the same time we are part of solving another problem. But I think listening to Kirsten and what we've seen today, this example that we've seen this morning of the floating university in Berlin was a brilliant example how an artistic activist project can involve a community, regenerate a natural space in the city, in the center of Berlin, innovate how we look at water management, and change the narrative. I mean, that power to change the narrative, how we behave, how we look at water, how we relate to water, that was the power of an artistic collective experience that was part of an ecosystem where not only artists, but scientists, local governments, communities, you name it, they've all been part of that ecosystem to innovate and change the narrative. So there we go back to these frescoes that you've been sketching. But in order to kind of boost that innovative power and that narrative change, I'm sorry, it's a bit boring. It's what our kind of people always say on these panels, but we need stronger support and recognition, and that means more money, not only the breadcrumbs that we are getting now, and of course we always add, and very honestly, we are thankful for the breadcrumbs, but because they keep us alive. But at the same time, it's a drop on a hot plate. But the real thing is the public recognition, that getting back to that embeddedness in an overall picture, like in these frescoes, where the role of arts and culture is really that of good governance and societal innovation. And I'm afraid, again, boring, that brings me back to the good old mainstreaming discussion. We are leading two campaigns at the moment at Culture Action Europe. One is called A Cultural Deal for Europe, where we look at mainstreaming in a bit more sophisticated way, but also in a rather bold way, where we say, in analogy with the Green Deal, Europe needs a cultural deal. And if we look at the global level, that's our other campaign, where we team up with partners from around the globe to push for a cultural goal as an 18th Sustainable Development Goal, because of course we can identify culture and what it means for our sector and what we can contribute in all the 17, but we really need the support through an 18th goal to make that happen. And I don't know how that will emanate, how that will manifest itself. But I mean, one light of hope, spark of hope, I can read in the Work Plan for Culture that is the background document for all we do in the EU at the moment, where there is talk about an EU framework for culture, and that EU framework for culture, in all its broadness, in which it is explained now, could be a potential instrument to bring about this change, the fragmentation between heritage industries, the cultural sectors, and so on, to get to that reference point through which that ecosystemic thinking will be made easier for all the other areas with which we want to collaborate. And again, if I get back to that example of the floating university, that would mean that everything that is happening in such a project could be traceable with references of standards, working standards, quality standards, and would make it easier for funding from other policy areas and really breaking through silos, to use that other fashionable word.
Johanna, you are also a designer. Speaking of the floating university, you are an industrial designer, speculative designer, artist. We talked in the break a bit about the ambivalent nature of labels, but you work across sectors. And from your experience, how does this work across sectors, across silos, as Lars said, work in practice, and what are the conditions for it to work?
Thank you. So when I say that I'm an industrial designer, it's not true in the sense that I'm not designing goods for industrial mass production, but in the sense that I'm trying to, I'm using methods from industrial design, and I'm also using industry partners as allies and collaborators in implementing ideas and topics that I want to pursue. So these topics usually have something to do with our emotional relationship with new technologies. And so I might end up with Stölzle Oberglas, a big glass producer, looking at a very humble protagonist in glass recycling, which is the shard, because in an antique but also newly restored understanding of our relationship with our planet, appreciating the object also means appreciating the broken object. And so the outcome of that project that I initiated was an installation with a lot of shards that they gave me, like tons of shards actually, and a budget they gave me. So I'm trying to find budgets in the industry to implement my ideas. Or last year I worked on a project with Willhaben, which is Austria's biggest market platform, on the creative potentials of using their search engines. So I actually use their search engine. I have a search agent, Futuristic, and whenever someone puts an object online and says this is futuristic, I will get a little note because I'm interested. I'm using it as a research tool to see how people talk about the objects, their everyday objects. So I'm actually, so I was discussing a lot with them the potentials of this, which for them is just it's just a search engine, but for me there's a whole culture around it, and I wanted to explore that. And so usually I get my money and my funding from their marketing departments, which isn't ideal because obviously when you work with marketing, you're telling their stories. But there's a few tricks for me that work well in being able to still kind of do what I want. So I use comedy a lot, and there was a project where I wrote, and when I say I actually mean we, because I never work alone because I hate it. So I always look for people to work with from different disciplines. Could be a photographer or a director or an actor or whatever. And so that we wrote a comedy trying to communicate research that was being done in Seestadt, which is it's a new part of town that's being developed in Vienna, and they're a kind of testing ground for smart grids and buildings exchanging energy. And we wrote a play to kind of create a narrative that people could join in, who live there. And I think with comedy, so as a speculative designer, with us speculative designers, usually you can divide us into the ones who are like pushing utopian narratives and the ones who are pushing dystopian narratives. And I feel like through comedy, you kind of escape this decision, and you can actually, you can have both and kind of talk about messy things, but do it in a light-hearted way. So I think what I do looks successful from outside and also sometimes feels successful, and I'm trying to tend to the feeling that also small things make a difference. But it's still, so from outside, like Forbes giving you recognition for what you do, but then it's still precarious, and it's still obviously hard to find the budgets, and it's a bit frustrating because I'd much rather just do the creative work, but in the end it's a lot of yeah, obviously it's a lot of convincing work to do to talk industrial partners into doing a project with an open end and working with design in a kind of design they might not know yet. Yeah, so it's hard, but great.
Okay, yeah, so that asks for more funding, but also for different mindset at the industries and the different kind of appreciation of the sector. That brings me to Kirsten. You are also a creative by background, by training, as I understood it, and we could see in your presentation, I think that. And you are the Chief Executive Officer in an innovation ecosystem that is very technical also and depends on technology. How did your cultural creative background help you see this topic of green transformation in a different light than, let's say, an engineer's perspective? And how do you communicate with this landscape in your Climate-KIC?
Well, I have a background in art history and cultural history. So my interest has all my life been in how do humans make a world that they believe in and understand. So the making of meaning structures through the built environment, through art, through textiles, through all sorts of things. So I don't very often explain to people that my background is in that, because very often I learned early on that it's one of the most powerful hacking capabilities to simply just slip into the system coming from this background, because my training is in reading symbolisms, reading subtexts, looking for meaning and understanding or asking myself what's the difference between what's being said on the surface or what's being represented on the surface and what's going underneath, possibly at several layers. So I get into the work that we're doing in the built environment, and one of the things that I'm going after is the 3 pig story. We're telling our kids that the worst possible thing in the world would be to build a house made of wood, straw. We've got narratives that go back to fables that tell us that the bad thing, you need to build out of concrete and brick. So unpicking some of that sounds like child's play, but it's not. This is adult's play. You've got to unpick this in the heart of risk management systems and insurance structures and fiscal mechanisms. So I find that my training in art history and cultural history in working across kind of art, culture, history, economy, politics, science it helps me read across. It's also taught me, I mean, I'm a medieval art historian, medieval Renaissance, and one of the things that's fascinated me, as you will have seen from my own inquiry, is how did it happen that for 600 years in Europe, in some places in Europe, societies governed by men who were elected every 6 months managed to maintain building programs that are consistent? Because we couldn't do that now. Every single 6 months, we'd have a change in regime, change in policy, change in funding. How did they do it? And my work as a historian was to go into the archives and understand how on earth did this happen. And it really has to do with the power of a very, very carefully constructed narrative carried through generations that keeps explaining to people, who are you? Why does this matter? Why does being who you are get you what you want? And to continue to invest in the artistic representation of that. And there's lots of reasons for why, which I won't go into now, but it's genuinely fascinating. So one of the things that I learned is what I call castles in the air. If you depict something so powerfully that it takes root in the imagination, we as a species tend to make that possible. And the way we do that is technology. But technology is derived from a way of making possible something we aspire to get to. And for me, that's why it matters so much, as what I'm able to bring to my work. I think the other thing is, my experience of working in culture and creative industries is these are the spaces that hold space for very difficult conversations that are ethical, that are profoundly diverse. In Sydney, there's something called the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, And it's a thing that happens every year, that you bring some of the most difficult, really, really uncomfortable conversations into public discourse. I think there's a way of holding space for that physical, institutional, that now becomes incredibly important. And there's no other field of human practice that is trained for doing that, that has the institutional forms, the social forms, and the ways of bringing human development and human ways of sense-making and meaning-making into difficult conversations. And we need to have some really difficult conversation with rural land relationships, with urban communities, with migration, the way in which we think about resources. So for me, I'm sitting with that as a way of kind of knowing, a way of looking, a way of reading that I find very powerful.
Yeah, I think this answer makes quite clear that we need also the societal conditions and the mindsets in society to be open for transformation and to make the Green Deal happen, for example. And Ambra, you are exactly doing that in Sweden at RISE CC and also at RISE Sweden and EIT Culture Creativity. You are fostering these ecosystems for societal transformation. And when I say that word, I always have a slight issue, because the green transition is pretty clear, very hard to attain, but we have the Green Deal, climate neutral Europe 2050, the Paris goals. So that's pretty clear, even hard to achieve. The digital transition, we also have a feeling what we mean here. We know about AI. We don't want to be ruled by a computer in 2050. We have the big platforms, the GAFA companies and their hegemony. And as Europe, we also want to put something against that. I think Maria Gabriel, former commissioner, spoke of a war of content even. So also there we have the vector of the change, and the AI Act of the EU, I think, is a good start. But societal transformation is much more disputed. We all know we are aging as societies. We become more diverse on all spectrums of what diversity can mean. We know that liberal democracy is under pressure, but it is not as clear politically and socially where the vector is that we should be going. What are the desirable future for social transformation? How do you tackle that when you start these processes?
I would like to go back to practices. So it's about designing for transforming practices. We need this shift. And I will not get into the wording itself, societal transformation. What I like is that it implies that we all need to transform, so the transformation comes down to the personal level and then scales up to organization, societal level. But we all need to deal with the sufficiency, with what we think is thriving, what is actually prosperity, how can we live with. How do we live with, how do we make kin with, how are we part of something that is not just us as individual? And we have been in this narrative of being individual and shielding off from the rest of the world for many, many years now. So that has to be reversed in a way. And what I think is also important is it's a pity that societal transformation doesn't have a verb inside, because it is about verbs, as Sanet says. It's about the action, it's about the transition. It's about rethinking the world in terms of processes and becoming instead of goals. And accepting the uncertainty that things are mutating. And I think that the culture and creative sector has that amazing skill of being able to harvest the uncertainty, not just to stand it, but to harvest and to make it flourish and to make it bloom. There is something also about care in societal transformation. I do think that societal transformation leads to the green. We can't get to any green transformation if we do not start from restructuring categories and the way that we deal with things and with each other and with nature. And there is something about rethinking in terms of who am I, what am I becoming? Can I become care? Am I becoming care if I do a certain action? And there's a lot of work around nomadic ethics that really looks at how can we relate to each other and become a meshwork of caring beings that goes beyond the being human and makes us feel part and take responsibility towards this meshworking together, this becoming together. One thing that I do wish that like this new role that the cultural and creative sector has had by initiatives like the new European Bauhaus, the new KIC that is formed, is that we shift from control to a collective reflective practice. We might want to give up looking for certainties, creating databases, mappings, control mechanisms, analysis, and we start making things and reflect and prototype and iterate and reflect together and create a discourse and this ability to understand what is not working, how do I tweak it, how am I comfortable with failure, which is something that has been so demonized in our society. And all this relates to societal transformation. One notion that, for instance, we're working with is this, you were saying before, the partnerships is the mean to let go of control, of fear, of not knowing what to do things. So there are methods to support partnering and collaboration and commoning. There's plenty of those in certain worlds that are just waiting to be used. We are working very much on this notion of a declaration of interdependence, this process of keeping on rewriting a contract of collaboration when we enter in this transsectorial the groups, collaboration, teams of people that instead of gathering around the goal, they gather around the societal challenge, where they personally engage with what they're responsible for, what they can act upon. And this ability of understanding what can I do about it, how can I live with it, how can I contribute, is something that is not a practice that is that common. We do what is written in our job description, and we tend to be objective about the tasks that are done. But actually, how do I actually get into tapping into my sensitivity as a unique mass of cells and the bacteria and whatever constitutes me, and how do I tap into that sensitivity and I contribute with my specificity to a process of becoming? So all these are questions that are totally out of the way that we work nowadays, and I think it is about establishing and prototyping ways of tapping into those more and more.
Yeah, I think that connects well with Johanna. I think like the practical side of starting those processes. On your website, I read that you invite people to become active in shaping the world they want to be living in. And I think that also reflects a change you want to start to contribute, because shaping a world is kind of this transformative power we're speaking of. How does your work motivate other people?
Earlier it was said that foresight was about enabling people to think more in a more structured way about the future. I think, me personally, my job is to enable people to think in the future in a less structured, maybe poetic way. It's about charging futures with emotion and possibilities with emotion for us to be able to test them and to see what do we want and what don't we want, and also to find languages and new metaphors for the things that are changing around us, for things that are hard to grasp, for something that might be in the air, or for technological changes, that we often are just lacking the stories and words to describe them. So, because you said GAFA before, so it's Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, that was a term obviously before Meta came in, but a few years ago I developed a story with a few friends, and we're now publishing this story, and it's a story, it goes like this. So, in a kingdom not so far away, there's King GAFA, and he's very powerful and wealthy, and his wealth comes from a magical plant. It's the 01 crop, and all the peasants in his land are harvesting this crop and sending it all to the king. And so it's a story about data sovereignty. And we started with this small bit of story and went to different congresses and talked to people to ask them where they see themselves in this kingdom. So someone who worked at Facebook said, well, I work in a castle, and I know the king from times that were different, and he actually, he's not an evil person, so he wanted, it all got out of control, and we said, well, what got out of control? And then he told us to introduce dragons for the data brokers in the king's cellar. And then there was another person who said, well, I'm only... I don't send any crop to the king. I have all my own servers and everything set up in my living room. And so we were saying, well, maybe you live next to the dark forest, but what does that mean for you in terms of communication with the other peasants and so on? And so we just kept developing the story, and now we're bringing it out as a book with 5 different chapters, and there could be more. And so I think it's very powerful to introduce these stories that enable us to talk about very difficult matters in a very fun and light-hearted way, and for us not to fight, but to have fun actually in this debate.
Oh, that's a great example of the storytelling, which now comes a hard cut to policy making again. Maybe you can also tell us a tale on that. But as you know, this project is exactly about that, the policy making side as well, Lars. And you are this bridge from sector to policy making. To do more of that, what Ambra and Johanna have been telling, how should the sector ideally be involved in the framework conditions, in creating policies that are doing that?
I like the story very much, but I don't have one. I'm afraid. But maybe if I think of it, I can contribute images to yours. Well, I mean, there are great examples how we have been involved in the policy conversation. And this morning we've heard more about the working conditions, for instance, and the unique initiative of the Parliament that kind of goes hand in hand with the Council's efforts. And I think the sector had a lot of possibilities to input there, and did that in huge numbers, and sees very positive results. So I think we have examples where we can show how that process can work. At the moment, we are running a project which is called Pop the Vote, because we think our sector is intrinsically political. We are political actors as cultural actors. So we are trying to mobilize our creative forces, not only to get people to the ballot box, but also engage young makers to create images that impact policy. And I think there we maybe get to that part of recognition that we would need, which requires a long-term investment in taking the language of the arts serious. Because I realize also during the conference on the future of Europe, where we also have engaged young artists to contribute with visual performative contributions to Ursula von der Leyen's project, that was almost impossible to understand for policymakers. It was kind of the nice to have illustration to what was going on. And I mean, that is just a small example that we can extrapolate to research, for instance, which is now separated from, tragically separated from the arts. And we are doing acrobatic exercises to kind of put artistic research, art practice-based research back on the agenda to bridge that gap. But it's very difficult to understand for policymakers what that means, that we have these messy methods that are unpredictable and that produce knowledge in a form that we are not used to read anymore, or that seems very far away from the hard knowledge that we normally communicate. A long story short, I think it needs long-term investment, and a very concrete area is, of course, the project funding. I mean, we could look at the Horizon program and see and ask ourselves, why does it always need to be a university to lead projects? Why can't it be an art center to do the research and ask the research questions or get to that research question through an artistic approach? Which may be very surprising and messy, but get to that, open up that area in which we can struggle to become. And on the community side, where we, all together need long processes to engage in that process of becoming, instead of searching for our belonging, where do we belong in Europe? Heritage is one of the examples where we tend to ask the questions of belonging, but can that heritage be a space of becoming where we lead that struggle together? There, the project logic doesn't work. It's not a thing of starting somewhere, ending 3 years later, and trying to prove how the ideas could or might be sustainable. It's a longitudinal approach where trust is needed, where we don't need to control outcomes, but say, we empower you to play, to experiment, to fail. So in a way, I would say we need to challenge the way we, even if it's seed funding, how we support these imaginative spaces in which solutions can be found that root out and that don't evaporate after 3 or 4 years.
Catherine, we're coming to an end, and if you hear all those voices now from the sector, from the innovation ecosystems, what are the most important points you take back with you from this discussion that you think could be taken up further in the coming cycles?
Okay, so I have to say I feel a bit lonely here because I'm the only one here representing an institution which, institutions have set ways of, giving out funding, of taking decisions, and where to start? Trust. Yes, trust is essential, but at the same time, you can see nowadays in the context of pre-election how the slightest, misuse of funds or whatever can make so many things derail, right? It's blown out of proportion in the press. So basically, yes, we would need to be able to fund open-ended, artistic thinking research projects while squaring the circle, and being able to answer all sorts of internal auditing and other standards. Now, I'm aware that by saying that, I'm the bad one here, right? What a boring speech. But still, what I want to say, what I keep and what I retain very much are the words bridge, language, storytelling, because really it's about building bridges also between us, the way of thinking, the way of designing policies, I'm not sure how many people in my institutions would be able to understand some of the things that have been said today, or translate them into ways of operating and managing policies or funding programs. That's why we need to build bridges, to design a language that can be mutually understandable, and that's why stories are so important. The story you said, kingdoms, castles, dragons, reference points that are universal are so important. Also, listening to Kirsten and Ambra, really, we won't be able to change mindsets if we don't support, artists and a freer way of thinking. But also, it starts with education. It starts with schools, and education policies really have to be part of this conversation if we want really to change things when it comes to the way we consume, we produce. So that we can, keep a livable planet, but also be able to understand a design thinking approach or a different approach to the one that is being practiced and taught to kids from a very early age.
Thank you. And you are not the bad one. You know that King Gaffer is the bad one. I think we all understand that. So let's close on a positive note, as Kirsten told us in her presentation. And one quick answer by everyone: imagine a Europe that has successfully, and the world basically, it's not about just Europe of course, but managed the green digital transformation, is climate neutral in 2050. We are not ruled by King Gaffer or an AI commissioner. We are still societies that talk to each other. And we are looking back from 2050 to 2023. And why were the culture and creative sectors so crucial in making that change happen? What decisions did we make in Europe and beyond in the 2020s that led to this great success that we are looking now? Maybe starting with Kirsten, and then we're going back. And we have 5 more minutes, or 4.
We would do this in a way that is designed for humans, and for humans in a much larger sense of self. So I think that means emotions. It means ways of thinking about how do we equip people with the capabilities to turn every crisis into a generative possibility. And it also means that we need to understand humans make things. I completely agree. I fundamentally agree this is about making new possibilities, making new institutions, making new institutional forms, creating new habits. I think our biggest challenge, and if this would be the one change, we have been talking about climate change. It's not about climate change, it's about human transformation. So let's make for humans, design for humans to become and to be becoming in relationship with one another. That would be an achievement.
And if I can follow up, was it 2050?
2050.
Yeah, okay, so Catherine wouldn't feel alone. Because institutions have participated to this practice of collective reflection and learning. So it's not about giving, but it's about learning together and prototyping together and making and understanding and reshuffling and creating new ways of being institutional. And where competencies like creative optimism or systemic sensitivity, we don't even have to talk about them because they are ingrained and embedded in our being.
Whoa, that's very difficult to add something even more positive. But I think, I agree to everything that is said. Looking back from 2050 to 2023, I think we will look back at a process in which we've finally broken the disciplinary borders and talked to each other and reinvented the way we tackle problems and not feel instrumentalized, but feel as contributors to a new institutional, social, human structure in which the arts don't need to scream from a tree anymore that they need recognition, but are a flourishing part of all other players in the field.
Okay, so if we look at, what is it, 2050? Well, by then the EU will have enlarged. And what does that mean? Why is that important and relevant to the conversation? Because if the EU gets bigger and includes more countries, it has to reform. It has to change its treaty, right? We cannot function now, you know, as we do when we are 27, if we are like, you know, 30 or 35, God knows, by 2050. So if the treaty is changed, then the culture becomes a shared competence, not a support competence. When, as it is now, but a shared competence. And that changes just everything, because then we can play our full role at EU level, sharing with the countries, the member states, and the regional level, where for the time being, you know, I mean, the competences lie. So we can play our full role in shaping cultural policy for a world that is human-centric, and you know, yeah, a world which is human-centric and a world which is livable. So if we do that, that means that we will have proper funding throughout all EU policies. Silos will have been broken or will be easier to break. We will have a strategic framework guiding where to go, where we go with cultural policies and forward. And what will underpin all that? The fact that culture will have its own goal in the Sustainable Development Framework, because we are in 2050, post-2030. So that conversation will have happened and will have succeeded thanks to the alliance between the cultural and creative sectors and, you know, I mean, the UN, the government, the institutions that are currently starting to reflect on the post-2030 agenda. Voilà.
Voilà. Voilà.
Famously, it's harder to imagine, or it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So actually really hard to imagine what things will be like or feel like in a different economic system. I feel like that must still be the goal. So I would hope that in 2050 we would be able to just listen to George's guitar music and not worry about intellectual property, but just listen to his music. Yeah.
Thank you. I would say, yeah. Let's become the persons and institution to make exactly that happen. And let's give a roaring applause. I hope this is not bad English, to the panelists and to the Bravka who will deliver the closing remarks of today.